define knowledge? Maybe you want to write your ideas down. How would you define knowledge? And do you think knowledge is possible? This topic came up after two other talks I've given recently. One was the EPS talk I gave, I think, April 13th on ancient philosophy's search for a logos. At that talk, there were a few questions about knowledge. And then I gave a talk at the Smart Faith Conference on what is Christian philosophy, and there were a couple other questions about what is knowledge. And I think on Facebook there was some back and forth. So I decided this will be the third in that series, discussing what is knowledge. And it's an argument I've kind of developed from my dissertation that I completed a year ago, and am currently revising and am seeking input to see if the argument actually works, because I wouldn't want to publish it if the argument didn't work. All right, so I'm going to read to you a long quote, this is on the handout, by Alvin Plantinga. Alvin Plantinga is a contemporary philosopher. I think he's emeritus professor now at Calvin College, but he is known for his work in Reformed epistemology. So here's the long quote. It would be colossal understatement to say that Anglo-American epistemology of this century has made much of the notion of epistemic justification. First, of course, there is the widely celebrated justified true belief, or JTB, account or analysis of knowledge, an analysis we imbibed with our mother's milk. According to the inherited lore of the epistemological tribe, the JTB account enjoyed the status of epistemological orthodoxy until 1963, when it was shattered by Edmund Gettier with his 3-page paper, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? After 1963, the justified true belief account of knowledge was seen to be defective and lost its exalted status. But even those convinced by Gettier that justification, along with truth, is not sufficient for knowledge, still mostly think it necessary and nearly sufficient for knowledge. The basic shape or contour of the concept of knowledge is given by justified true belief, even if a quasi-technical fillip or addendum, the fourth condition, is needed to appease Gettier. Of course, there is an interesting historical irony here. It isn't easy to find many really explicit statements of JTB analyses of knowledge prior to Gettier. It's almost as if a distinguished critic created a tradition in the very act of destroying it. So my argument is going to be centered on this quote, that in the creating the tradition, he destroyed it. So maybe I should tell you my argument. It's not on the handout. So my argument is that the justified true belief analysis of knowledge is a post-Nietzschean definition and is the opposite of what Plato thinks knowledge is. So this tradition goes back to Plato, saying Plato defined knowledge, and then they say Plato defined knowledge as justified true belief, and Gettier claims to find a flaw in the definition of knowledge as justified true belief. My argument is that Plato thought that knowledge was the very opposite of what Gettier thinks it is. Right, so that's my argument. See if it works. All right, why am I doing this? What's the goal of this? Why did I write this dissertation? 3 goals. One is to retrieve a definition of knowledge that gets us to what is clear about reality and the good life. Second, a definition of knowledge that overcomes skepticism, which says nobody can really know, and fideism, which says nobody can really know, you just have to believe. And the third goal is to revive public philosophical discussion of our deepest concerns. I think that skepticism and fideism block that discussion, are roadblocks. So I've made a little slide up here. And the slide is contrasting the justified true belief account that Gettier proposes with Plato's account, which is what I'm naming the TOA account, that knowledge is true opinion with an account versus knowledge is justified true belief. And I hope as we go along, you'll see what the difference is between those two. Incidentally, I want you to write down your questions, keep your questions fresh, so after this talk we can discuss them all, because I'm hoping for some good feedback. All right, so I'm going to talk about Plato's version. Now notice they both say knowledge is cognitive, involving belief. I put that up because some of the questions I've been noticing about the definition of knowledge have to do with things like knowledge by acquaintance or know-how. So this is not knowledge by acquaintance. Knowledge by acquaintance is something you can only know by direct experience, like what a lemon tastes like, or know-how, like how to ride a bicycle. This is propositional knowledge, which has to do with belief, and beliefs are cognitive, which means they have to do with thinking, and beliefs are in the category of true and false. Does that make sense? Okay. So Plato gives, I'm going to say Plato or Socrates, I'm going to go back and forth with those, a definition of knowledge within the dialogue called the Theaetetus. And I'm going to give you a little context for the discussion of this definition of knowledge. The context, and now I'm on the handout, is that Socrates is arguing against the dominant philosophies of his day. And the dominant metaphysics is materialism, that all that exists is matter. And it had gotten to a point where this matter is continually in motion, it's in flux, and nothing is permanent. So all is impermanence. The dominant epistemology of his day is empiricism, that all of our knowledge is through sense experience. And a result of these two combined, materialism, that is a kind of radical materialism where everything is in flux, combined with empiricism, says that if everything is in motion and everything is material, then I'm also material and I am also changing constantly. There's no permanent knower and there's no permanent thing that can be known. And this is what brings about the skepticism of his day. And this is very similar to our day, so I picked this dialogue and this topic because I think there's analogs in contemporary Western philosophy. So this idea that skepticism is the dominant position, nobody can really know, results in sophism, or the sophists. And the sophists are paid rhetoricians. They teach you how to argue well to get what you want. So there's a kind of power involved with speaking well. So they want to persuade people, but not through proof. Now Socrates is addressing all of these, and he wants to use arguments to persuade. All right, so they go, in this dialogue, there are two main characters, Socrates and Theaetetus, who is a young person who's a mathematician, and he's studying under Theodorus, who is also a sophist or a student of a sophist. So this young person could either go the way of sophistry or he could go the way of philosophy. And Socrates is testing this young man to see if he has potential to be a philosopher. That's the background context. So he asks him this question, how would you define knowledge? This is the very first question. What is knowledge? And Theaetetus says, knowledge is perception, right? This is usually how people answer. Knowledge is perception. And Socrates argues against that position vigorously. Why? Because perception is of what is changing and impermanent. Your perceptions are always changing. Think about it. You're changing. Your senses are giving you data, and the data is always changing. So Socrates says, no, knowledge is what is of unchanging and is of what is permanent. So knowledge can't be perception. Right? Now, maybe you have some objections to that. So think about it. The next thing they talk about is maybe knowledge is relative. This is what the sophists taught. Knowledge is relative. Protagoras was one of the sophists they addressed in their discussion. And Socrates says perception is subjective, based on the subject who's doing the perceiving, and it's not shared, and it is relative. So perception is relative. So if knowledge is perception, then perception is relative. But guess what? Knowledge is objective, and it's shared. And that's why Socrates is involved in this process of dialogue. He thinks through the dialogue you can get knowledge. It's a shared pursuit, and it's an objective, and it's an objectively testable cognitive content thing we can get. All right, so knowledge is, the objective aspect of knowledge is what allows for philosophy. Philosophy is the shared pursuit of the truth, and Socrates strongly believes that you can get to what is true. All right, the next thing they talk about is knowledge is not opinion. Opinion may be true and it may not be true. And the word for opinion in the dialogue is doxa, D-O-X-A. And doxa is like seems. It seems to me. It's a seeming, it's an appearing. So knowledge is not what seems. Knowledge is of what is. And then lastly, they test this. Is knowledge true opinion? Aletheia doxa. Is knowledge true opinion? True opinion is not good enough for knowledge for Plato because he thinks you can obtain it by chance. Maybe you happen upon a true opinion. Maybe you're right at one moment, but not at another moment. So he thinks you need something more than just a true opinion. Incidentally, he thinks that you can change your opinion. Maybe you have a true opinion and then someone gives you a counter argument and you have no response, and so you lose your true opinion. You kind of are loose. You're at loose ends because you don't know how to respond. But he also thinks that true opinion is good enough for right action. So if you have knowledge and you have true opinion, you're going to do the same action that's right. So he does value true opinion. He doesn't say it's bad. He just says it's not the same as knowledge. Okay. So they get to this at the end of the dialogue, that knowledge is true opinion with an account. And that's where I got the TOA. Knowledge is true opinion with an account. We're going to call it the TOA definition of knowledge. Now, an opinion is a judgment, and judgments come in the form like X is Y. For example, my car is in the parking lot. That's a judgment. It's either true or false, right? Kino is the best dog. I don't know, that might be an opinion. He actually is the best dog. God is a being that exists, right? Now, how can we make those, how would we know if those judgments are true, in fact? So true is what is according with reality. So for the sentence, my car is in the parking lot, to be true, that sentence has to match reality, right? The car has to actually be in the parking lot. For Kino to be the best dog, that reality is such that he is actually, testably, provably the best dog, right? For God to be a being that exists, then that could be shown, right? If it's knowledge. All right, so true is what accords with reality and is objective. Now, Plato thinks that a logos is what makes true opinion into knowledge. So this has been the theme of the last 3 talks I've given, the logos. And a logos, for the context of this dialogue, is reasons or an account. It's what ties down your true opinion. Think of having a pickup truck full of stuff in the back, and you don't want the stuff in the back to fly out. You have to cinch it down, right? So think of an account is what cinches down your true opinion. Is not going to move. It's going to stay put. All right? So logos is what ties down, guarantees, or certifies true belief. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what Socrates thinks about this logos. A logos is an account or is reasons. It's not sense data. And a logos is necessary truth. Necessary truth is, it couldn't be otherwise. So it's necessarily that way. Does that make sense? A logos is proof, and it's often derived by elimination of the logical contradiction or the opposite. So Socrates is often involved in this conversation where he's trying to prove a position by showing the opposite positions make no sense. They lead to contradictions. And you can only do this with reason. A logos is what is needed for philosophical claims. So it's not necessary for science or for mathematics, according to Socrates. So I've drawn this line here. I'm going to talk about this next. So a logos is needed for philosophical claims, and philosophical claims are about the most important, most foundational and important questions we can ask and answer, according to Socrates. Maybe you want to object to that. All right, so this allegory of the line is where we can see a kind of gradation of understanding, thinking, cognitive commitments. Plato thinks that the bottom is the least certain, and the top is the most sure. So the bottom level of line is where we have imagination at play, and imagination is connected to myth and poetry or imitation. If you remember, Plato bans the poets in the Republic, and it's because they're giving this kind of level of information. It's not real. It doesn't get us to reality. Right above imagination is opinion, doxa. And doxa is based on what seems, and what seems is the senses, what the senses deliver to us. This is the cave, life in the cave, if you remember the allegory of the cave. We're in this darkness, watching shadows on the wall, and we take those shadows to be reality, and then we start boasting about what we know about those shadows. That's the level of opinion, and it's the common person's view. The top half of the line is where we're getting more towards understanding and grasping what is. We're grasping reality. And I put understanding here because he talks about true opinion and understanding at this level, but this is where we can have probability. And he talks about mathematics and science and understanding the world in this way, but the world doesn't, our senses in connection with the world and understanding the world doesn't give us certainty, it gives us probability. So he gives us one more level, and that's the level of knowledge, and he thinks knowledge is obtained by doing philosophy, the dialectic, the give and take, the defining of what is. And we grasp knowledge by means of reason. So this is, I think we can use this to see, Plato doesn't say either you know it or you don't know it. He talks about levels of, I'm going to say understanding, levels of commitment, and levels of evidence, different kinds of evidence. And this is the one we need in philosophy. So I've been talking about this in my talks in the context of philosophy, and people are asking questions, but I think those questions might be coming down here. So we'll have to make those distinctions as we get to the discussion portion of the talk. All right, so maybe you want to see an example of how does this approach of using reason to get knowledge in philosophy work. So I'm giving you one example. Here's a philosophical claim. Something must be eternal. At least something must be eternal. How would you show that? You would show that by proving the contradiction, the opposite, nothing is eternal, leads to impossibility. It's metaphysically impossible and thus logically impossible. And you can only do that through reason because this is not something you can empirically verify. And if you want to go through that process, through the discussion period, we can do that. So that's one example of how we could know something by elimination of the opposite. Something must be eternal because the opposite, nothing is eternal, is contradictory, and we can show that. All right. Knowledge is of fundamental philosophical claims about ultimate reality. Some people get really nervous, like, hey, we can't have knowledge of a lot of things then. I think Plato would agree. Maybe there's not a lot of things that we could know, but the most important things we could know. For example, what is reality like? What is human nature like? Do humans have a soul? Can we know that? And what is the soul like? And what's good for humans and what's evil for humans? Socrates thought we could know that kind of thing. He thought we could know that matter isn't eternal. Actually, he argues against that position in the dialogue that matter is eternal. He says, no, it's not. He gives an argument. All right, so knowledge is the source of the good for human beings, according to Socrates. And I think if you think about it, there's some truth to this. Socrates thinks that the philosophical life is the best because it brings knowledge of what is the good. And the good is what is good for humans. So if humans are rational beings, it's good for humans to use reason to gain knowledge. This is the highest pursuit in life. and knowledge is gained by conversation in community. Now, this is Socrates. I happen to think he's right, but you are free to object. All right, so that's the TOA version. All right, Plato's. I think I probably covered this. We'll come back to the certifies part. Let's talk about Gettier. So Gettier is a philosopher. He wrote this little paper in 1963. I think he thinks Plato says knowledge is justified true belief. But when you look at what Gettier means by justification, it isn't the same. So he agrees knowledge is cognitive, is about beliefs that are true or false. And for Gettier, justification has to do with sensory data or testimony by another, what another person says, which is based on their sensory data. So let's see if Gettier and Gettier and Plato would agree. Plantinga is going to be on Gettier's side of the definition. All right, so Gettier's justification is not a rational account. He's not saying you have to have reasons so that the opposite is impossible. His definition gets us to probability based on sensory perception at best. The Gettier examples, is anyone familiar with the Gettier examples? Do I have to give you one? I'll give you one. These are torture for students. Gettier examples. I don't want to torture you, but you have to experience it to know the skepticism that results from these. I'm going to give you my favorite one, the one I was tortured with as a student. So Gettier says, all right, if knowledge is justified true belief, a person can have a justification and there be truth and the belief is true and knowledge is not a result. So let me give you an example. He says, he doesn't say this, somebody else does. Imagine you're out in a field and you see a hill and there's a sheep on the hill. And you form the belief there's a sheep on the hill. And maybe you leave after that. You're like, there's a sheep on the hill. And you think you know this. But in fact, what you saw was not a sheep. It was a sheep-shaped rock. But behind the sheep-shaped rock was a real sheep. So here's a case where you're justified in forming the belief there's a sheep on the hill. It's true there's a sheep on the hill, and you believe it, but you don't have knowledge. Right? And all the Gettier examples are like this. It's really annoying. But they're all based on the senses. So I put up here that sense data or testimony can be mistaken, misunderstood, ambiguous, or dependent upon cognitive function or environment. So all of these things can interfere with your having justification for your belief. We could talk more about these if you want to. I can give you a website that has like hundreds of Gettier examples. I could give you personal Gettier examples that have happened to me. So they all rely on empirical data or testimony. Plato would disagree with Gettier's definition of knowledge. Why? Because he does not think justification, or what I'm calling an account, is based on the senses at all. He would put that down here. He would maybe even put it down here. So Gettier's definition is more like true opinion at best and opinion at worst. Alvin Plantinga is a Reformed epistemologist. He wrote 3 pretty meaty books on this topic. And he is going to respond to Gettier by saying, hey, justification isn't even necessary for knowledge. We don't need justification. And he provides his own piece that guarantees true belief. He calls it warrant. And I don't really want to talk about Plantinga right now, but if you have questions about him, we can do Plantinga as well. But what is common with Plantinga and Gettier is they both agree that justification is based on the senses. Plantinga will also buy into this empiricism that Gettier does. All right, so neither Gettier or Plantinga get to a rational account that guarantees true belief based on a logos. Both assume empiricism, which is the very thing that Socrates was arguing against. So I'm calling them post-Nietzschean philosophers, because Nietzsche was a philosopher who threw off everything that Plato affirmed. And philosophers after Nietzsche who assume materialism, empiricism, skepticism, are in the same boat as the sophists of Socrates' day. So Gettier and Plantinga, unwittingly, are going to fall into that post-Nietzschean philosophy. All right, now there have been questions about certainty, a lot of questions about certainty. I don't know how to get around this. It seems as though certainty is, we have to be certain of something. And even if we want to say knowledge is only probability, probability assumes a standard of certainty. You can't have probability without something being fixed. But I have read a philosopher recently who talks about, instead of certainty, certifying. So he says that perhaps, and he's still in this mode, perhaps justification certifies true belief or makes it guaranteed or objectively true. So we could talk about objective certification, and this is not the same as the subjective condition of being certain, because I could be certain about a lot of things and be completely wrong, right? Subjective psychological certainty is more like a feeling that I have rather than a position that could be tested by others to see if it's true. So we want to talk about, if we're going to talk about certainty at all, let's talk about it as objective and testable, like proof. Now, another piece is that proof is not the same as persuasion. I could give proofs to people and them not be persuaded by those proofs. Socrates does it all the time. I'm not sure at the end of this dialogue that Theodorus, who's there observing all of it, is persuaded. He's probably still a sophist. So just because you've given a proof doesn't mean the person is going to be persuaded by that proof. If something is knowledge, then an account can be provided. So and we do this all the time. If someone goes off making knowledge claims, we often say, prove it. Why do you think that? That's what Socrates is doing, right? He's going to the politicians and they're saying, this is justice. And he says, prove it. Do you even know what justice is? What is justice? If someone claims to know, then an account should be provided. And this is also what Socrates is doing. He's showing, hey, you're claiming to have knowledge, but you don't have an account. And it seems like he thinks there's some kind of harm in making a knowledge claim, but not having an account to back it up. There's some kind of harm being done there. All right, and I ask, what about fallibility? Because this is a question that comes up often. The fallibilists and the infallibilists, it came up in my dissertation. So let's make a distinction between human beings who are fallible in knowing we make mistakes often, and because we make mistakes, humility is probably required. But knowledge itself is something objectively true. And so knowledge isn't fallible. People are fallible, but knowledge is not fallible. It seems like a category mistake to say knowledge itself is fallible. It's like saying reason, the laws of thought are fallible. The law of identity is fallible. I'm not sure what that would mean. People misuse the laws of thought, and people are fallible. All right, and this last piece is about moral culpability, because that was the larger context of this discussion. If something is easily knowable, and human beings ought to know it, there's moral culpability for failing to know. Now, that's a claim I've been making, and so have some others that you know, and that's probably the one you want to test. How is moral culpability for failing to know experienced? So maybe I go around making false claims all the time, and nobody can stop me. How is it experienced? What is the culpability part, right? There's no, well, I guess there are thought police, but pretend there aren't. You guys going to stop me from saying false things? Kino is the best dog. Oh, yeah? So what happens when we do believe things that are false? Failure to know the basic things leads to ignorance of what is true and what is good for humans. It seems like we'll be trapped by falsehood. Plato talks about it as being stuck in the cave. We're trapped without knowledge. We think we know and we don't know, and we're harming ourselves. Ignorance is harmful to the individual. I'll use the term darkness of mind. we don't understand. And it's harmful to society. Now, if you think ignorance is harmful to society, how's that? Well, think about Socrates in the story in the Apology. If you're not familiar with that story, you should read it. It's the end of Socrates' life. And this is where he's brought to court. He's tried and found guilty for corrupting the youth of Athens and teaching strange gods. He defends himself quite well. He hasn't done that at all, but because the people of Athens are ignorant, they sentence him to death. And so Socrates is an example of ignorance in the people leading to injustice in the city-state. So I think we can say, yeah, ignorance can lead to harm in the individual and harm for the community. All right, now in class when I teach this definition of knowledge, I usually just do this last little part. So we'll call it a fillip to mollify Gettier. And maybe we can just say, hey, we use this word knowledge all the time, very loosely, and sometimes we mean one thing by it. Maybe sometimes it means something like this, and sometimes it means something like this. So instead of saying there's Plato knowledge and Gettier knowledge, we'll say there's knowledge with weak justification, and then there's knowledge with strong justification, where we're using the word knowledge kind of loosely. So what is knowledge with weak justification? We can say a belief is weakly justified true belief, or knowledge is weakly justified true belief, where weak justification is sensory data that provides a high probability of truth. And this is probably sufficient for most of our everyday beliefs. Like when I say I believe my car's in the parking lot, it's probably good enough, right? I don't need to be super sure about that. It's not a life or death issue. But strong justification is needed for those life or death issues. And strong justification is by reason and argument such that the opposite is impossible, which means it's necessary for our philosophical claims, like, does God exist or not? What is human nature like? What is good and what is evil for humans? It seems like we want to be certain about those things. Or we want to not be certain, but have an account that certifies our true belief. And that's what philosophy is about. When you take out that bit of giving an account, it seems like philosophy ceases, and we're doing something else, something like sophistry maybe. Now, I want to return to these questions. How would you define knowledge, and do you think knowledge is possible? I'm going to pause here and open it up for discussion at this point. I hope that wasn't terribly boring. Remember, I'm revising my writing, so I need to know if this argument works. Are these actually different definitions?